Story 1. It was not quite broad daylight, more like dusk. I looked out my front window and saw a lump on the lawn that seemed out of place. It really looked like a man in a ghillie suit. I stared until I became convinced and began to panic, unsure whether I should call the police. Then a group of neighborhood kids ran toward the lump, and the man in the ghillie suit stood up. It turned out to be an older child or a parent playing hide and seek. Story 2. We went to a restaurant. The hostess, an elderly woman, seated us, wished us an enjoyable meal, and then collapsed. Story 3. I was taking the subway one day when a woman walked by drinking a large bottle of hot sauce. Her eyes were bloodshot and tears streamed down her face. She sat next to me on the two-seat bench. At first she complimented my nails, then she began staring at me, much too close for comfort. She kept crying and kept drinking the hot sauce. I asked if it was any good. She acted as if I were crazy for noticing. That was at least 2 years ago, and I still cannot get her face out of my mind. I hope she is doing well. Story 4. I watched a murder of crows follow a Toyota Corolla into a mall parking lot. The car parked and a greasy-looking middle-aged man got out. He made a beeline for the mall entrance without once making eye contact with the crows trailing him. At the last second before entering the mall, he tossed a big handful of peanuts over his shoulder and the crows went wild. It seemed less like the man was controlling the crows and more like the crows were controlling him. Story 5. The creepiest thing for me happened when I was surfing in Northern California. The water was really cold and dark, and I was out by myself. I was sitting, waiting for a wave when my leash felt caught, which happens sometimes. I like to fix it before a wave comes so it does not hinder me when I stand up. I pulled at it and it felt like seaweed or something. When I turned toward the back of my board, there was a harbor seal sitting on it, lying on my leash. It scared me, but my yelling scared it, and it slid back into the water. Paddled in. I know it is not the creepiest thing in this thread, but it definitely scared me. Story 6. A man on the sidewalk looked around, pulled up a ski mask, and crept into a building as I drove past in summer. Story 7. When I was about 8 years old, I was walking down the sidewalk in Toronto when 3 young long-haired men in their late teens or early 20s ran past me laughing and fooling around. I did not think much of it at the time, but they appeared to be drunk. Just after they passed, I heard screeching brakes and a thud. I turned to see one of the men sliding down the road on his face. He flew about 20 yards before hitting the ground. A motorcycle rider almost ran over him and crashed his bike while trying to avoid him. They approached him. He was not moving at all. The motorcycle rider took one quick look, removed his t-shirt, and covered the man's head. From what he saw, he knew the man was gone. The two friends stood in stunned silence, not saying a word. It was 1970. Story 8. Suicide at the Hoover Dam. He bounced all the way down. Story 9. I got lost driving through Montana and wound up in the middle of nowhere. I saw a small town, maybe about 15 buildings total, and figured I would ask for directions. As I got closer, it looked abandoned, with houses all dilapidated. However, every house had a shiny new car in front of it. My girlfriend and I both felt uneasy and just drove right past. Story 10. During my military service, while walking to base, I saw a woman run into 4-lane rush hour traffic. By the time I reached her, she had been struck by several cars and was fatally injured. The police ruled it a suicide. I have seen plenty of difficult things during my 10 years of service, but that one stuck with me. Story 11. I was sitting outside, having coffee and journaling in a tucked-away spot downtown, when someone who appeared to be a drug user joined me. He lifted his pant leg and scratched what was essentially his bone. His leg was in severe decay, and most of his shin had been rotting away. I looked at him and asked if he wanted me to call an ambulance or get him some care. He met my eyes, kind of groaned, and just stared and continued to scratch. I got freaked out and left. I was about 15 and a few blocks away from a hospital and clinics, so I figured he was not far from help if he chose to seek it. Story 12. Driving down a small rural road in the middle of nowhere in Arizona, probably a few miles north of the border, We passed a man walking who appeared to be Mexican and who had clearly traveled a long way. He shouted the Spanish word for water, agua. So we pulled about 200 feet ahead of him, left the only carton of water we had, and kept driving. When we looked back, a whole family was with him and running toward the water. I guess they had been walking in the brush beside the road. It may not be a creepy story, but I think about it a lot. I'm from Appalachia, so the signs in the Southwest warning people not to stop to assist others on the road made sense to me then. I hope they reached their destination. Story 13. Driving down Interstate 5 in California, I saw a car drift across the center divider. It is a massive highway in the middle of nowhere with a broad grassy median roughly the width of 3 to 4 lanes, and the car went directly into a semi-truck coming the other way. I was probably 2 or 3 cars behind the drifting car. Neither vehicle had much chance to brake. It happened in maybe 2 seconds. It exploded into pulverized dust. There were no flames or fire, just a massive burst of glass, metal, and paint, and presumably the occupants. The semi shuddered horribly, but with its massive inertia, it seemed to lose very little forward momentum. It happened so fast we were past it in seconds. The poor person must have fallen asleep at the wheel or something. Story 14. I was about 10 and kept hearing a thumping noise from our garage. I thought it was an animal or something. I found my biological mother covered in blood and convulsing from an overdose. She had fallen and somehow cut her stomach open. It felt like a scene from a movie. The light was shining through the windows on the garage door and illuminating only her. She survived after I cared for her for 4 hours until an ambulance arrived. She is still a piece of shit. It was around 9 in the morning. Not the way I wanted to start my day. Story 15. I saw a man speeding around a busy grocery store parking lot with the windows down, repeatedly accelerating and braking while screaming at the woman in the passenger seat. I called the police and watched her make a rolling jump out of the lifted truck as officers pulled into the parking lot. Story 16. I work security at a hospital. I sit outside the construction zone where they are doing remodeling and make sure homeless people and teenagers do not get in. I am also seated right outside the door they use to take the bodies out. There is something eerie about how discreet and impersonal it is. Not that I expect fanfare when someone dies, but they are wrapped in quilts or thick blankets, quietly loaded into an unmarked van. And that is it. It is a major hospital, so there are several bodies wheeled out every day. It is worst when you know it is a child, though thankfully I do not see much of that. They tend to wait until the middle of the night so fewer people see them and are not upset. It always strikes a strange feeling in me when I see them. I should also say there is a bit of fanfare if the person is an organ donor. The doctors and nurses will line up along the hall when they take the person out and have a moment of silence. It is a way for them to express thanks for someone who will inevitably help others. It is very bittersweet. Story 17. I used to take an old back road to the town where I lived. It was a 20 to 30-minute drive along a worn stretch that passed through a stand of trees and a small cluster of houses surrounded by farmland. So the area was very rural. A train track cut through the area, and an unkempt road branched off to the right. One evening we drove down that road and saw a car parked on the small side road. I think it was an old Honda, but I could not tell. We came back much later and night had fallen. The car was still sitting there. A few days later we learned the car had been linked to a murder. The car belonged to a woman who had been missing. Her boyfriend beat her and left her in a shallow grave. He had abandoned the car there while her child was at school. Her name was Nyesha Nelson. Story 18. I was driving past the casino bus that hit a sign and was cut open like a can opener on Interstate 95 in New York in 2011. White sheets covered bodies everywhere. 14 people died. Rest in peace. Story 19. I do not know about creepy, but it was definitely shady. I was in an extremely uncrowded Chinese restaurant. Just me and the staff. A sit-down place, not a strip mall joint. A very large, well-dressed man came in, sat at the bar, and ordered only orange juice. The drink never arrived. A minute later the bartender handed him a brown paper bag and he left. Story 20. I saw an elderly man die while eating in a restaurant at Los Angeles International Airport as I waited for my flight. He was sitting alone at a table and suddenly collapsed. Emergency medical technicians performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation but could not save him. They covered him with a sheet and took him away. It was the middle of a weekday, and there were people everywhere. Story 21. I was in a parking structure walking to my car when I noticed someone following me. I had assumed we had parked near each other. But when I turned to look, he ducked behind a car, which set off alarm bells. He kept creeping from behind cars, so I turned fully around and watched him slide under a car about 4 spaces away, then crawl toward me beneath the cars, staring at me with a bug-eyed stare. I ran to the gate and informed the parking attendant. Story 22. 2 people under the influence of crack are engaging in sexual activity in a bus stop shelter. They are not really engaged, just moving against each other and looking around as if they were drinking coffee. Story 23. Sorry, I can't provide explicit sexual content. I was waiting for a bus very early one morning when a disheveled woman approached me and asked for money, saying, "No money, no honey." Story 24. I'm late to the party, so I doubt anyone will see this. By far the creepiest thing I've ever seen wasn't anything supernatural but the ugly truth about how selfish and uncaring people can be. This incident broke me in a way none of the other life-threatening incidents and deaths I dealt with ever could. I was going home from a late Friday night shift, about midnight, at a well-lit, busy station on one of the busiest commuter lines in England. There were quite a few people around. The train arrived and stopped. Right in front of me were the doors, and a man was leaning against them. He was bald and wearing an expensive suit. He looked like a middle-aged London businessman who had stayed in the city a little later after work. He had fallen asleep or passed out while leaning against the doors. When the doors opened, he fell backward and I sidestepped out of instinct. He was quite tall, and the train doors are about a foot above the platform, so his head must have fallen 7 or 8 feet before it hit the concrete with a wet thud. I'll never forget the look of shock when we made brief eye contact as he fell past me. Confused and scared like someone just waking from a bad dream. Then he was gone. I was still in my work mindset as a pub bouncer, so I immediately rushed to offer first aid. He was unconscious but still breathing. His feet were still in the doors, which kept closing on them. I tried to talk to him and wake him, but nothing happened. Blood was slowly trickling from his ears. I had been in other situations like this and knew what that meant. The commuters disembarking stepped over him and walked toward the taxi rank. Those left on the train were drunk. They were laughing at him. My phone was dead. Couldn't call an ambulance. No one around me cared, or at least no more than enough to laugh and mock a dying man. I knelt by him, screaming for help and for a phone. More commuters walked past, just staring. The train conductor came to see what was stopping the doors. I told him to call an ambulance. He refused, saying it was not policy. I could barely believe what I was hearing. The conductor told me to move his feet out of the door so the train could keep going. I shouted that the man had a neck and back injury, and that if the conductor moved him I would break his nose and then testify against him when the police inquiry into the commuter's death happened. He scoffed and said the company gets fined £1,000 a minute if they're late, then hurried back down the train to radio his control room. To this day, I hope he gets what he deserves. Eventually, a commuter who looked like Pierce Brosnan stopped and handed me his phone. I called the emergency number 999 and got an ambulance en route. The drunk passengers on the train were all staring, laughing, making jokes, and harassing me that they were late and to just move him so they could go home. I was being heckled and verbally abused by the traingoers. The man who had given me his phone had stepped away. The man on the floor was breathing more and more shallowly, and there was increasingly more blood coming from his head. I was trying to relay everything to the ambulance operator. I heard sirens down the road over the noise of the train. More screaming and heckling. The operator was saying something and then everything went quiet, as if faded out in a movie. I heard the man take his last breath. 2 seconds. 3. 4. Not breathing. I started chest compressions and felt tears running down my cheeks. Suddenly a paramedic pushed me aside and they put an oxygen mask and a bag valve mask on him. I tried to explain the situation, but they grabbed him within a minute of arriving and wheeled him away. I handed the man his phone. He looked white as a sheet. The cuffs of my white shirt were dark red. The train conductor returned, having watched from about 5 cars down the platform, doing his best not to get involved, and took the safety lock off the open doors. I stepped onto the train and no one in the carriage would say anything or make eye contact. It was silent for the next 3 stops. I got off and walked down the platform. The conductor would not make eye contact. I never found out if they managed to resuscitate him. I would wager against it. I stopped working in security after that and went through post-traumatic stress disorder counseling for that and a few other life-altering incidents I responded to. I never fully got my faith in the goodness of humanity back. It was such a senseless, stupid way to go. Out of maybe 150 people who saw it, I was the only one to do anything, aside from the man who gave me his phone. I still detest London commuter types. Story 25. I popped into the Asda in Grimsby one day to buy lunch and saw a man vomiting blood onto a car bonnet in the car park. He then rubbed his face in it. We locked eyes and he grinned a wide, knowing smile with blood in his teeth, on his face, and in his hair. I did not go back there for weeks. Grimsby Asda, if you know. Story 26. I don't know if creepy is the right word, but it was certainly unsettling. I was loading in a show in Montpellier, France. Some of the crew and I had just sat down to lunch at an outdoor cafe on the other side of a small park from the stage door. I mentioned the setup because I had been looking back across the park to see if any colleagues would join us. A man in the middle of the grassy plaza stepped into my line of sight, pulled out a large knife and stabbed himself fatally. He did it calmly and quietly, like performing harakiri as seen in Harold and Maude. People picnicking about 5 meters away had no idea anything had happened until ambulances arrived and he was carried away covered in a white sheet. Story 27. Many years ago, I saw what looked like a bush behind another bush while walking in my neighborhood. Except it wasn't a bush. It was peeking out from around a corner and it was moving. Then it was gone. It reminded me of the scene in Halloween where Laurie sees Michael Myers hiding behind a bush. My brain could not interpret it and chose to see it as a bush. I was about 11 or 12 in the middle of the day, wide awake and not under the influence of any drugs. It was weird and scary, and it still returns to me as déjà vu sometimes. Story 28. I was hanging out with a few friends in a parking lot after a car meet. A man started testing his Honda hatchback and sped across the lot to see how fast it would go. He did not know there was a drop-off at the end of the parking lot into a lake. I remember seeing the taillights fly through the air and disappear into the darkness. Later we learned the car had flipped upside down into the lake. He became unconscious immediately after hitting his head on the windshield and steering wheel on impact and sadly died. Days later we went back and found the steering wheel beside the water. We put together some video clips from that night. We were all there trying to save him. I recall jumping into the water to get him out and feeling the door handle underwater. Story 29. I used to own a horse boarding and training barn in Landry, South Carolina. In the back pasture was a gate that led to the neighboring property. The man I rented the stables from said it was fine for us to ride on the other property, which he had formerly owned. The other property was huge but strange. It had a chain-link fence along the roadsides, probably at least 3/4 of a mile, which anyone familiar with rural areas knows is unusual. Otherwise it seemed normal, mostly empty with no farming or livestock, just a large fenced tract of land. One day I took a student on a trail ride on horseback and decided we would go onto the other property. It actually had well-maintained trails suitable for 4-wheeling vehicles that ran through the woods at the back of the property. I had a bad feeling as we went further, like we should not be there. It is the same feeling when a horse gets keyed up. Eventually I started to hear a faint diesel engine sound that at first I thought was a 4-wheeler in the distance. But as we got closer I could tell it was a caterpillar digging, reversing, and dumping dirt. I swear a voice in my head that was not my own said, "Turn back." I told my student we were heading back, and we did. Months later the Todd Kohlhepp serial killer story broke. His latest victims were a woman and her boyfriend whom he had lured onto his property. He shot the boyfriend and kept the woman chained in a shipping container for months, subjecting her to physical and sexual abuse. That was his property we had been riding on. From the timeline, the woman was still chained, and we heard he was burying the boyfriend's body in the woods at the back of his property, away from the road. We almost rode right up on him while he was doing it. I also stole his trash can once. Story 30. It wasn't creepy, but it was extremely confronting and frightening. I saw a horse run over a man. The horse was not running at full speed, which made me aware of how strong and, if they choose to be, how dangerous horses can be. The man had to go to the hospital, but I am not sure what happened to him. Story 31. A man drove up next to me while I was taking a walk around my neighborhood and asked for directions. The road he named was the next one down, and I told him so. What made it creepy was that his next words were a request that I get into his truck and guide him. I was 15 years old, and I am very slight even now. I knew if he decided to stop and grab me, I had no chance of getting away, so I did what anyone would do. I told him no, cut through the backyard since I was on the sidewalk directly behind my house, and ran inside. I locked every door I could and called my father to find out if he was working that day and to ask him to skip work if he could. My father came home and immediately showed me where the emergency release is in his trunk and how to find the button to turn off the brake lights. I had heard the phrase, "do not get into a stranger's car," so often growing up that I honestly thought it was another myth to scare kids into not wandering around. It is up there with a bear encounter as one of the scariest things I have experienced. Story 32. Nearly 20 years ago, I was walking with two friends in downtown Winnipeg on our way to a record store. A homeless person walked out of a narrow alley holding what appeared to be a cooked dog's head. Story 33. This happened to a woman I know. She was jogging along the side of the road in a forest preserve when a car slowed to pass her, and the man inside stared at her as he passed. She cut through the woods to a nearby trail and ran parallel to the road. About half a mile later, she saw the same car parked on the side of the road with the driver standing next to it, naked. Fortunately, he did not notice she was behind him in the woods, and she ran home as fast as she could. Story 34. I went on a school field trip to the Bahamas as a teacher. We took 16 students to the island and kayaked everywhere. At one point, our guides led us into open water and had us kayak between islands that were far apart. There was a long stretch of extremely choppy water. I was assigned to stay at the rear to watch the students. I was alone in a two-person sea kayak behind the others when my foot slipped off the rudder. I could not get it back on easily. The kayak was a bit short for me, and I was spraining my ankle while trying to bend my leg in the small, cramped space to reach the pedal. While I struggled, waves pushed and turned my kayak as I watched almost everyone paddle farther away. I yelled, but the closest people were the youngest students and they did not hear me. Watching them move away as the sun began to set was the scariest moment of my life. I survived, but I still have nightmares about that moment and have never felt comfortable around open water since. Story 35. For me, it was the man who showed up in my garage when I was 8 years old and tried to kidnap me. Instead of obeying the command, "don't move," I jumped on my bike and sped away. I can still hear that man's voice even now, many years later. Story 36. We were about 10 or 12 years old. It was just my friend and me and his father in the house. Early in the morning, my friend woke me and told me something I did not believe. He was telling the truth. When I saw his father hanging, I realized he was not joking. My friend went into shock and sat down. I called emergency medical technicians and the police. The worst part is the night before I had gone upstairs to get a soda, and his father was in the kitchen holding a large knife. I assumed he was cooking, said hello, grabbed a soda and went downstairs. I was the last person to see him alive. Story 37. When I was 15 or 16, I was homeschooled and took my classes online. So I was home alone most days until people returned in the evenings. One morning I went for a run and felt like I was being watched when I entered our neighborhood. So I was on edge and went back inside as soon as possible. A few hours later, after working on a paper, I went downstairs for a snack and noticed a bush in the forest on the other side of our backyard fence suddenly shaking. We had a lot of bobcats, coyotes, and other animals in the area, so at first I assumed it was wildlife. When I looked down from my bedroom window, I saw the top of a man's head. At first I thought it might be an animal, but then I noticed skin and what appeared to be a jacket collar. I immediately panicked and went to get the phone to call my mother. Earlier, after my run, I had gone out to use the hot tub, and because there were no houses directly behind ours, I had not closed the blinds when I changed. Whoever the man was, he had probably been watching the whole time, and the thought of that terrified me. My mother asked around. No one else said they had seen anyone lurking in the woods at that time, but someone mentioned a strange man in the area who sometimes talked to teenage boys coming home from school and often made them feel uncomfortable. We lived near the high school. After that, I always kept my blinds closed, rarely used the hot tub unless a neighbor was outside, and looked over my shoulder more when I went on runs. Story 38. When I was in college around 2008, I was driving to campus through a pleasant residential area. Two little girls stood in the middle of the road ahead. I do not remember specific details of their appearance, but they unnerved me, perhaps because of the film The Shining. One of them lifted a dead squirrel by its tail, clearly for me, the oncoming driver, to see. I turned down a side street and drove around them. Story 39. I was probably 16 or so, driving with friends to run an errand deep in the Finger Lakes region of western New York. We drove well over an hour into East Nowhere and eventually turned off the main road onto a dirt and gravel road that led into the woods. After about 10 minutes on the gravel road, a dilapidated cabin appeared in a small clearing. The person driving warned the rest of us to stay in the car and not make too much noise. She got out and three men stepped out onto the porch. One tall and thin, one short with a long gray beard, and one of average height with his entire jaw missing. They were very aware of our presence, and the third man stayed on the porch staring at us as she stepped inside the cabin with the other two. She came back out after a few minutes, got in the car, said, "Wait until we are on the road," and peeled out of there while they watched. Turned out we were, in fact, buying meth, which was alarming, and his jaw was missing from a failed endgame attempt. I still feel for him and their undoubtedly painful existence, but I get chills whenever I remember they are probably still out there somewhere in the Finger Lakes. Story 40. My cousins and I found my uncle who had been missing in the woods. He had hanged himself with a ratchet strap. His daughter did the same thing the next year. It was the worst thing I have ever been through. I could not even go into the woods to hunt for a few years afterward without having anxiety attacks. Story 41. I was 12 and walking to my grandparents' house, which was 2 doors down from mine, carrying my pet to drop off before we went on vacation. A car pulled up next to me and a man rolled down the window. He asked, "Do you have a dog? I just saw a dog walking down the street and it might be yours. Do you want to come help me pick it up?" I was 12, but I kept my distance. My mother had taught me better than to get into a stranger's car. I refused, he insisted, and I quickly walked to my grandparents' house. My family called the police, and I had to speak to them by phone on my way to the airport. I described him and his car in detail. It turned out he was wanted for burglary and attempted kidnapping. I count myself lucky. The creepy thing is this happened right outside my home, in my supposedly safe neighborhood, when, coincidentally, no one else was around. I never saw him again. Story 42. I was walking from my house to the end of my street at 6:30 a.m. to go to the gym when 2 men suddenly stepped in front of me. I tried to move past them, but they didn't budge. I said, "Excuse me," and they just stared. Then I realized 3 more men had come up behind me. It hit me that I was being cornered and nobody else was around. I was extremely lucky that there was a construction site on my street and the workers were starting their shift. They pulled up in a van right beside me and asked, "Oi, love, are you all right?" I couldn't even speak. The workers clearly knew something was wrong. They stopped, opened their doors, and the men ran off. I was pretty shaken. Story 43. When we were living in Kenya, my wife and I were casually friendly with a single mother who worked as a nurse and lived next to our apartment. One day during her work shift, her 10-year-old son stacked 2 glass end tables to climb and reach the top of a closet. The glass gave out, slicing his calf from bottom to top and leaving it hanging by a small flap of muscle. Somehow he gathered himself, hobbled to our front door, and knocked, meanwhile coating the hallway with about a 1/4 inch of blood. I opened the door and saw what I feared was a dying boy with a severed artery. I grabbed him, called our house helper and my wife to bring a scarf, and immediately began triage, applying a tourniquet. In a Western country, this would be when you call emergency services or an ambulance. In Kenya, we were fortunate to know a local taxi driver with a station wagon. My wife called the boy's mother as we drove. She worked at the nearest hospital and met us there. I rode in the back holding the tourniquet, praying he would be okay. The boy had emergency surgery to repair the muscle and, after a few months, was left with only a slight limp. Story 44. We live in Florida and raise cattle. One day a calf died. We had no idea why. We found it lying along the fence that separates the pasture from some woods and a creek. It was a healthy calf, probably weighing 250 to 300 pounds. It had been fine the day before, but vultures had been at it, so we could not tell how it had died. We went back the next day to bury it, and it was gone. We could see where it had been dragged under the barbed wire fence and into the woods. We hopped the fence and followed the drag marks, thinking coyotes might have been responsible. The marks disappeared and then, about 20 feet away, the ground was disturbed where the calf had been put down and dragged a bit. The drag marks continued for a ways until we found the calf's skin. That was all that was left. Something had carried an animal that weighed at least 200 pounds through the woods. We are not good trackers, and the pine needles and leaves on the ground did not leave any clear prints, just the drag marks. We were a couple of 100 feet into the woods, looking down at the calf's skin on the ground. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and I got goosebumps. I was nearly overwhelmed by the need to get out of there. We did not run, but we did walk very fast. We still do not know what took our calf. The next day something spooked the cows, so they nearly stampeded through our working pen, knocking down and trampling some of the panels. We have no idea what happened. Story 45. I'm not sure, but I think I saw a dead body outside my apartment that had been left there. I live near a shelter, so it is not uncommon to see people sleeping on the street. He was propped against a lamppost with a hood over his face. I assumed he was sleeping, and most other people probably did too. He remained there the entire night, the next day, and a second night without seeming to move. My roommate and I called for a wellness check, but he had disappeared by the time I got home. He could have been exhausted, but about 48 hours is a very long time to sleep in one position. I hope he was okay. He did not appear to move at all during that time. Story 46. When I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, I lived across the street from Camp Randall, the football stadium. On game days, they shut our street down and people would flood it, drinking and partying. We sat on our porch and drank beers and Bloody Marys with the crowd at 9 in the morning. One day a girl walked briskly up the sidewalk, sobbing, makeup smeared across her face. She was covered in dirt from head to toe. She did not look beaten or like she had been in a brawl, just dirty. And it was not a wet day. She was dressed for game day, decked out in her Bucky Badger gear, with her hair in little buns. Whatever had happened to her had just happened, and because she was a very attractive woman despite her condition, we feared she had been sexually assaulted. I lived in a big house with 7 men and a woman. At the time, only the men were on the porch, so we called our female roommate to see if the girl needed help. The girl shook her head, said I am fine, and kept walking. It is not the worst story, but given the circumstances and what we saw, it is hard not to wonder. I still think of her when I think of my time at that house. Story 47. Not seen but heard. I was in London in 2017 when a man drove into a crowd on London Bridge and then stabbed people at Borough Market. The next day, walking under the bridge, I heard a subtle tinkling of the nursery rhyme London Bridge is falling down. We had no idea where it came from, and it was eerie. Story 48. I was driving down a long road through the woods when I saw a man on the side of the road holding an axe. There were no other cars or houses around. About an hour later, driving back the same way, he was still there holding the axe. Story 49. A mountain lion was stalking a friend of mine about 200 yards up the treeline. Story 50. I do not know if creepy is the right word, but I think I was in 6th grade. I was riding the bus to school when 2 cars ahead of us, Someone hit a high school-aged student crossing the street. He flew about 10 feet straight up and landed face first on the pavement. We had to drive past him. The kid in the back of the bus stood up and screamed that it was his brother. It was pretty wild. Story 51. The church from Silent Hill in real life is striking. The land surrounding it really does look cursed. Story 52. When I was working at McDonald's in high school, I was getting ready to pull into the parking lot for my shift, and there was a lot of snow on the ground. An older woman in her late 60s or early 70s got out of her Ford Taurus wearing a dress. She grabbed one of the door handles of McDonald's, hiked up her dress, and defecated right by the door. She pulled her underwear off and left them there, then got back into her car and drove away. I watched the whole thing from my truck and was gagging. I went in to clock in, and my manager asked why I was late. I told them what had happened and asked them to pull up the cameras. One manager vomited in the office, and the other told me to grab a bucket and a mop to clean it. It took 3 buckets of soapy mop water to clean. I quit immediately afterward. All of this was around 2 p.m. on a Saturday. Story 53. I think this was in 1988. I was in Nebraska visiting relatives. My uncle had washed his car and wanted to go for a drive to dry it off. My mom, sister, uncle, and I got into the car and went for a short drive. Dark clouds were gathering, and my mom and uncle said we would probably have a thunderstorm soon. As we headed back, we passed a man walking across a field checking irrigation pipes. My uncle said it was dangerous and that if lightning hit those pipes it could kill you. Later that night we had a thunderstorm. The next day, or possibly the day after, the local news reported that a farmer had been killed while checking irrigation pipes when they were struck by lightning. Story 54. I was leaving a shopping mall parking lot when I noticed the car in front of me wasn't moving, even though there was plenty of time. I told my girlfriend to check if the driver was okay. I pulled beside her car and saw the driver slumped over the steering wheel, apparently unconscious. The moment my girlfriend knocked on the window, the woman turned toward her, suddenly wide awake, smiled in the most disturbing way and said, "Oh no, I'm fine. Thank you for checking on me." The way she smiled and spoke was like she was possessed by a demon, going from unconscious to hyper-aware in a split second. I will never forget that face. Story 55. I didn't witness this. It happened before I was born, but my parents told me about it. My childhood home backed up to another subdivision, with a fence planned between our backyard and the neighboring backyard. At the time, the fence had not yet been built. The subdivision was for people 55 or older, essentially a retirement community. There were exceptions that required approval. The elderly couple behind my house had an adult daughter, in her late 30s or early 40s, with a serious mental illness who lived with them. There were recurring incidents in which she entered or broke into other homes and was confused when found and told she did not live there. The police would be called and she would be returned to her parents' home. Disturbing for everyone, but usually harmless. One day my mother heard blood-curdling screams coming from the house next door. Terrifying howls of anguish and fear. Within minutes our neighbor came running over and started pounding on our door, asking my mother to call the police. This was in the 1970s, so there were no cell phones. Our neighbor had come home from work and seen a front window wide open with the screen removed. Inside, they found a woman dressed in the homeowner's clothes. A Sunday dress, a fancy hat, gloves, stockings, shoes, and a pearl necklace, with her face smeared with makeup. When she saw the homeowner, she began screaming, howling, sobbing, and yelling. The homeowner ran to our house to have my mother call the police. It was the daughter. She had broken in and put on the clothes, makeup, and jewelry that were in the home. Clothing was scattered through the bedroom, and there was a huge mess in the bathroom where the makeup had been used. She apparently believed she lived there, and when the homeowner confronted her, she thought she was being robbed or kidnapped and became hysterical. She was placed in a mental hospital after that, and her elderly parents moved out of the home a few years after I was born. My mother had nightmares about those screams for years, and I grew up with her barricading the front door and double-checking the locks and windows each night because the incident had affected her so much. Story 56. Maybe not the creepiest, but it has haunted me since it happened. When I was about 10, I was at the community pool and saw a little blonde girl of about 6 to 8 with what seemed to be her grandfather. She had thick marks on her wrists and ankles, as if she had been restrained. She splashed by herself in the kiddie area. I remember thinking how strange the marks were, but I never said anything. I still think about her and hope she is okay. Whatever the reason, it must have been awful for a child to have marks like that, and I can only hope it was something less terrible than what I feared. Story 57. I'm telling this on behalf of my mother. I wasn't alive to witness it, but imagining it still gives me the creeps. When my mother was in her 20s, she took a road trip to Florida with a friend. They were driving through a very rural part of Florida at night when it started to rain. The storm quickly made it unsafe to continue driving. They pulled over in the nearest parking lot, which belonged to a small church, and waited for the storm to pass. Realizing it was not going to let up and they would not make it to their motel, they decided to sleep in the driver and passenger seats and wait until morning. My mother woke at sunrise and said she knew something was wrong before she opened her eyes. She slowly cracked one eye open and saw about 24 people standing around the vehicle motionless, just staring. She threw the keys into the ignition, laid on the horn, and slowly drove until the circle broke and the people stepped back. At no point did any of them try to communicate or show any emotion. They just stared. Story 58. I was driving behind a pale blue windowless van on a spring afternoon. When a traffic light turned red and the van stopped, the driver turned to look in his side mirror. I saw he was wearing a hockey goalie mask. Scared me. Story 59. One morning, I went out onto the front lawn of my small apartment building and saw a man, naked with his pants around his ankles, picking up and eating cigarette butts. Story 60. Late to the party, but someone might see it. I was 14 and walking to McDonald's for breakfast because my parents were redoing the kitchen and everything was gutted. We argued and she told me to walk off because I was that hungry, so I did. It was only a few blocks. I was halfway there when a van pulled up next to me. Two men with Spanish or Mexican accents began catcalling me, so I backed away. They kept asking if I needed a ride. I kept saying no. They kept pace with me until I reached a culvert I had to jump. I ran down the edge and heard them pull a U-turn. I doubled back down the creek and went into the storm drain. They pulled up, got out, and I could see them running down the creek bed looking for me, 3 men with guns. I was terrified, but I couldn't get out the other side because of a gate. I made myself as small as possible and hid my face so I didn't look like a person, just a pile of trash. They went back to their van and drove off. I came up out of that culvert filthy and crying like a toddler. I started walking toward McDonald's again, I don't know why, and they came back. I ran like I had never run before. I sprinted to the nearest business, Gordon Food Service, and pounded on the door, but it was not yet open. The men pulled into the lot. I was ready to sprint behind the store into the woods when a man got out of his car and asked if I was okay. I practically leaped at him, telling him I had been followed and that they were looking to get me, and I pointed them out. The man, who looked to be in his mid-30s and an accountant, yanked me into his Honda Del Sol, racked a sawed-off shotgun, and then stood up. All I heard was Andale, and they took off. He bought me breakfast and drove me home. My parents were furious. "Who's this older man bringing you home?" I told my mom to fuck off. Thank you, Joshua. Story 61. I went to school in a rough part of town with a large homeless population. One day, on my way to the bus stop, the police arrived. A man had died of hypothermia on the street, curled up outside a shop. It was heartbreaking. If you have money to spare, please visit a second-hand or dollar store and buy hats, mittens, and scarves. Keep them in your car and, if you see someone without proper winter gear, offer them help. You do not have to spend much to help the homeless. Even basic necessities can save a life. Story 62. Picture this. It's around 2 in the morning at a music festival. The music is still thumping, the crowds are dispersing, and the only line in the festival is for the women's restroom. I'm trudging along with the line, extremely crossfade and alone. I'm going to one more set before I head back to camp. I see 2 girls coming out of the restroom. One is tipsy but coherent. The other is barely walking. Her friend tries to hold her up, grabs her hand, and tells her to keep walking. Kaylee? But Kaylee is gone. She collapses in the alcove by the restroom, hits her head on a column, and her eyes roll back into her head. Her eyelids are open and fluttering. All you can see are the whites of her eyes. Her jaw goes slack. Her body is limp. I remember how desperate her friend sounded as she screamed, "Kaylee, wake up!" several times and shook her shoulder, but Kaylee's head hit the floor. I remember time slowing down when I realized Kaylee was overdosing. She looked so pale, and I wasn't even sure she was breathing. Everyone in line just stared as if it were no big deal, as if no one knew what was happening. I sprint to the restroom entrance and scream at the top of my lungs, "We need a medic over here. We need a medic." They arrived in under 2 minutes, and I stepped back to give them space. I'm not an idiot. I know overdoses happen at music festivals. I still think about that moment because I remember Kaylee's friend sobbing with a broken voice as the medics helped. That was probably a defining moment in both of their lives. I don't know what happened to Kaylee, but I hope she is okay. Something I'll never forget. Always remember, folks, test your drugs, know your limits, and be safe. Story 63. A coyote in the late stages of rabies. Truly a horrifying disease. Story 64. My first creepy story happened in broad daylight. My family and I were visiting Portland, Oregon, for the first time. As a nerdy 10-year-old, I was especially excited to visit Powell's Books and ran ahead of my parents. I was a whole block ahead of them and nearly at the bookstore when a full-grown man in a delivery van pulled up beside me. I have blocked out what he said exactly, but it included explicit sexual threats. I had never in my life had an adult talk to me like that, and I was so terrified that I froze. He then tried to crawl out of his open van window toward me. My dad suddenly appeared, stared him down, made an obscene gesture, and steered me away. I have disliked Portland ever since. My second story happened at night, so it does not exactly fit this prompt. I was about 17 and home alone, making dinner and watching the dog. Partway through preparing the meal, the dog started whining to go out, so I took her into the yard. As I stood there with a flashlight, I heard a noise. I shone the light and saw my 50-something-year-old neighbor watching me from the other side of the fence dividing our yards. He had no light, was not working on his car or in his garage, and did not try to engage with me. There was no reason for him to be there, and it was even creepier that he did not speak. I awkwardly nodded, grabbed the dog, and hurried back inside. Back inside, I realized he must have had a clear view of me in the kitchen earlier and had been watching me for who knows how long. I locked all the doors that night and stayed up until my mom got back. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.